Strangely enough, Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, whose accidental succession to the presidency so heartened the Northern radicals, was both a Southerner and a Democrat. The career of Andrew Johnson has been generously re-estimated. Claude G. Bowers' The Tragic Era, 1929, is extremely readable but somewhat overdrawn. George Fort Milton, The Age of Hate, 1930, is eminently fair. Less satisfactory in the order mentioned are R.W. Winston, Andrew Johnson, Plebeian and Patriot, 1928, and L.P. Stryker, Andrew Johnson, 1929. He was not, however, of the Southern ruling caste, for his North Carolina parents were as humble as the Kentucky parents of Abraham Lincoln. And Johnson, quite as much as Lincoln, was a self-made man. Unable to forget the hard and unhappy youth that poverty in the slaveholder South had meant for him, he became a belligerent champion of the rights of the common people and a bitter enemy of the whole favored fraternity of Southern aristocrats. Migrating at an early age to Greenville, Tennessee, he worked at his trade as a tailor and ultimately became the proprietor of a moderately prosperous tailor shop. From his youth up, he was interested in oratory, and his love of argumentation seems to have furnished the stimulus that drove him persistently forward in his quest for learning. As a highly effective rough-and-tumble debater, he drifted easily into politics, a Democratic denouncer of the aristocratic Whigs. And for 10 years, beginning in 1843, he represented his district in the National House of Representatives. Twice during the 50s, he was elected governor of Tennessee, and the outbreak of the Civil War found him in the midst of his first term as a United States Senator. Although Johnson had voted for Breckinridge in 1860, he was an ardent advocate of compromise and conciliation, and he utterly refused to become a party to the destruction of the Union. Alone among the senators from the seceding states, he remained at his desk in the Senate when his state left the Union and gave his full support to the Union cause. While still a senator, he accepted Lincoln's commission to become military governor of Tennessee. And in that capacity, he worked with courage and with moderate success toward the carrying out of Lincoln's plan of restoration. C. R. Hall, Andrew Johnson, military governor of Tennessee, 1916. When the National Union Convention of 1864, composed of many Republicans and a few War Democrats, looked about for means of emphasizing its bipartisan character, the choice of Johnson for second place on the ticket with Lincoln seemed natural and logical. Lincoln himself insisted upon it. Had the delegates foreseen Johnson's accession to the presidency, no doubt they would have acted differently. His obstinacy and tactlessness were not unknown, and with the exception of his devotion to the Union, his political principles differed markedly from those of the great majority of the men who worked for him. Probably it was Johnson's well-known dislike of the Southern aristocrats that commended him most to the Republican radicals. Given to intemperate utterances, he had repeatedly denounced the, quote, slaveocracy, end of quote, as responsible for the chief woes of the South, including the war, and as president, he ordered the arrest of many high Confederate officials whom Lincoln had been minded to leave alone. "Johnson, we have faith in you," Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, a leading radical, told the president. "By the gods, there will be no trouble now in running the government." To this remark, Johnson is said to have replied, "Treason is a crime, and crime must be punished. Treason must be made infamous, and traitors must be impoverished." But as matters turned out, Johnson's vindictiveness was short-lived. Undoubtedly, he planned to rebuild the South with the long-neglected lower-class whites in control, but he was soon to learn that, whatever the status of the Southern aristocrat before the war, he was at the moment as penniless and as powerless as his humblest neighbor. Furthermore, Johnson as a Southerner was under no delusion as to the unpreparedness of the ex-slave for the full responsibilities of citizenship. For a time, he may have toyed with the idea of Negro suffrage, but if so, his common sense and his Southern background soon led him to give it up. More important still, he was at heart as much a states' rights Southern Democrat as he had ever been. Like Jackson, he was willing to go to any length to preserve the Union, but he wished to keep the powers of the national government at a minimum. To him, the Southern states were still states, and with them, rather than with the national government, the solution of their principal problems must lie. Thus, it soon transpired that Johnson, from the radical point of view, was quite as untrustworthy as Lincoln. For the time being, he kept Lincoln's cabinet intact and inclined more and more to the advice of its more moderate members. He gradually relaxed the orders he had given for the arrest and prosecution of Southern officials. He accepted as legal the loyal governments that Lincoln had recognized in Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Virginia. J.W. Patton, Unionism and Reconstruction in Tennessee, 1934. J.R. Ficklin, History of Reconstruction in Louisiana, 1910. T.S. Staples, Reconstruction in Arkansas, 1923. H.J. Eckenrode, Political History of Virginia during Reconstruction, 1904. And for the 7 other states of the Confederacy, he prescribed during the summer of 1865 a process of reconstruction quite as breathtaking in its generosity as Lincoln himself could have devised. For each state, he appointed as provisional governor a local man, not an outsider. And although every such official had at some time been an active opponent of secession, not one of them had fought for the North, while most of them had passively supported the Confederacy. It was the duty of each provisional governor to call a constitutional convention, the delegates to which were to be chosen by such members of the old white electorate as were now ready and were permitted to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. Johnson did indeed add a few new classes, including the owners of more than $20,000 worth of property, to those whom Lincoln had disqualified from taking the oath, but he promised liberal pardons to those who chose to apply for them, and he did nothing to ensure that even so small a number as 10% of the former voters must take part in the work of restoration. The constitutional conventions so selected were required: 1, to invalidate their old ordinances of secession; 2, to abolish slavery; and 3, to repudiate all debts contracted in order to aid the Confederacy in its prosecution of the war. But otherwise, they were as free as any other such conventions to write into their constitutions whatever they chose. Johnson specifically acknowledged that it was their privilege to decide who should vote and who should hold office. But he let it be known privately that for the effect such action would have upon the Northern radicals, he hoped that Negroes who could read and write or who owned a small amount of real estate would be permitted to vote. With their constitutions rewritten, the states might elect their own governors, legislators, and other officers and resume their place in the Union. Johnson foresaw that for several months he could proceed with his plan unhampered by Congress, which, to the distress of the radicals, could not convene without the president's call until the following December. By this time, he hoped to have state governments restored throughout the South. He knew that the radical leaders of Congress would resent deeply whatever he did, but he believed that they would find it difficult to undo a series of accomplished facts. Furthermore, he counted upon the approval of a majority of the people both in the South and in the North for what he was doing. In the former section, the easy terms he had prescribed should ensure him a strong following, while in the latter he hoped to rally to his standard most of the Democrats as well as the more moderate Republicans. He took seriously the name and implications of the Union Party, which had elected him, and expected it to become, with himself at its head, a kind of party of the center, opposed only by the Northern radicals at one extreme and the Southern irreconcilables at the other. When Congress met in December, Johnson's work of restoration was far along. The provisional governors had revived the old country and municipal government, sometimes with little change of personnel. They had called constitutional conventions, and in every state but Texas, the conventions had met. Unfortunately, perhaps, none of them had accepted the president's advice about allowing exceptional Negroes to vote, nor did they show any disposition to place restrictions upon the political rights of the former enemies of the Union. Furthermore, the first elections that were held showed that for the most part the leaders of the Confederacy were still regarded by the voters as the leaders of the South. In Mississippi, for example, an ex-Confederate brigadier general who had not even been pardoned as yet by the president was chosen governor. In Alabama, 3/4 of the members of the legislature had at one time or another fought for the Confederacy. And in Georgia, the legislature chose Alexander H. Stephens, late vice president of the Confederate States of America, to be United States Senator. Every legislature, however, except that of Mississippi, had promptly ratified the 13th Amendment. And before the end of the year, the president was able to tell Congress that only in Florida and Texas was the work of restoration incomplete, and that in those states it would be finished soon. The president's defense of what he had done was presented in an able message to Congress, the happy phraseology of which was due to the skillful pen of George Bancroft, the historian. The meaning of the message, however, was the president's own. In it, he maintained, more insistently than Lincoln had thought advisable, that the southern states as such had never ceased to exist, but had merely been in a state of suspended vitality. It had been his duty to assist in restoring them to their rightful energy, and this duty he had performed as, quote, gradually and quietly, end of quote, as possible. Inasmuch as he had found no constitutional warrant to do otherwise, he had left with the states themselves the problem of enfranchisement of the freedmen. As for the delegations that the restored states had sent to Congress, he believed that the adoption of the 13th Amendment warranted their reception, but of this each house of Congress must judge for itself.